I'm Professor Robert Brandom of the University of Pittsburgh. Today, my talk is Modal Expressivism and Modal Realism, Together Again. First, I'll talk about modal expressivism. Kant saw that in addition to concepts whose principal use it is to make it possible for us to describe how things are, there are concepts that make explicit features of the metaconceptual framework that makes such description possible. An important class of the framework explicating concepts, arguably the ones that motivated this whole line of thought, comprises alethic modal concepts, such as necessity and possibility. These express lawful relations between ground-level descriptive concepts and mark the special status of Newton's laws, their lawfulness, by contrast to the status of merely contingent matters of fact. But it's not only in understanding the use of technical scientific concepts that the modal concepts find application. The use of ordinary empirical descriptive concepts, such as gold and cat and house, no less than the Newtonian concepts of mass, force, and acceleration, are essentially and not just accidentally articulated by the modality those modal concepts express. It's because he believes all this that Kant calls modal concepts, among others, pure concepts, categories. Pure concepts are a species of a priori concepts. The sense in which we can think of them as available a priori, that I want to focus on, comprises three claims. First, what they express are structural features of the framework within which alone it's possible to apply any concepts, make any judgments, including ordinary empirical descriptive ones. Second, in being able to apply any ground-level empirical concepts, one already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to apply the categorical concepts. Finally, there are no particular empirical descriptive concepts one must be able to apply in order to have implicit mastery of what's expressed by categorical concepts, such as the modal ones, though one must have some descriptive concepts or others. The alethic modality that has this categorical status is something like physical necessitation. It's the modality involved in the pure principle that every alteration must have a cause, in Kant's terminology. A further development of what I want to claim will be retrospectively recognizable as the same line of thought can be found in Frege. His use of Latin letters and his logical sign of generality, used in conjunction with the notation for hypotheticals, express relations between concepts. It's always been an embarrassment for the anachronistic extensional quantificational reading of this notation, due originally to Russell, that Frege says of it when he first introduces it in his Begriffsschrift, that it's the right way to express causal relations of necessitation. For it's a commonplace of the later logistical tradition that merely quantificational relations between concepts cannot distinguish between contingent regularities and law-like necessary ones. For that, explicit modal operators must be applied to the quantified conditionals, and Frege doesn't have those. But Frege deploys his notation so that the relations between concepts expressed by generalized conditionals already have modal force. Relations between concepts of the sort logic lets us express have consequences for relations between their extensions, of the sort that our quantificational notation expresses. But Frege's generality locutions codify relations that we think of as intentional. Fregean logical concepts are indeed second and higher order concepts. But more than that, the universality they express is rulish. They are in the first instance principles in accordance with which to reason, and only derivatively premises from which to reason. In addition to permitting the formulation of purely logical relations among logical concepts, Frege's logical vocabulary permits us to assert necessary connections among empirical concepts that themselves can only be discovered empirically, physically or causally necessary connections. In the preface to the Begriffsschrift, Frege says, quote, "It seems to me to be easier still to extend the domain of this concept script to include geometry, we would only have to add a few signs for the intuitive relations that occur there. The transition to the pure theory of motion and then to mechanics and physics could follow at this point. The latter two fields, in which besides rational necessity, natural necessity asserts itself, are the first for which we can predict a further development of the notation as knowledge progresses. End of the quote from Frege. The additional signs that such an extension requires do not include modal operators. The necessity, whether natural or rational, of the connections between empirical concepts is already contained as part of what's expressed by Frege's logical vocabulary, even when that logical vocabulary is used to make claims that are not logically, but only empirically true. Nearer to our own time, this line of thought has been further developed and clarified by Wilfrid Sellars. He lucidly compressed his endorsement of the fundamental Kantian idea that modal concepts make explicit something implicit in the use of ordinary empirical descriptive concepts into the title of one of his essays, Concepts as Involving Laws and Inconceivable Without Them. But he also offers the outline of a more articulated argument for the claim. We can reconstruct it as follows. 1, quote, it's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate these objects in a space of implications that they describe at all rather than merely label. End of the quote. Second, it's an essential feature of the inferential relations in which, according to the first claim, descriptive concepts must stand that they can be appealed to in explanations and justifications of further descriptions. 3. So, quote, from Sellars again, although describing and explaining are distinguishable, they're also in an important sense inseparable. The descriptive and explanatory resources of the language advance hand in hand. Fourth, the expressive role distinctive of modal vocabulary is to make explicit those explanatory and justificatory relations. The two key moves in an argument of this form are first, an account of the descriptive use of empirical concepts that exhibits as essential their articulation by inferences that can support explanations and justifications. And second, an account of the central function of at least some alethic modal vocabulary as expressing explanatory and justificatory inferential relations among descriptive concepts. The conclusion of this argument is what I call the Kant-Sellars thesis about modality. The claim, namely, that in knowing how to use ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, one already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to be able, in principle, to use alethic modal vocabulary. According to this thesis, one cannot be in the semantic predicament that empiricists such as Hume and Quine envisaged. The predicament, namely, of understanding ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary perfectly well, but having thereby no grip at all on what's expressed by modal vocabulary. How does Sellars understand the distinction between what he calls merely labeling, on one hand, and describing, in the sense he then wants to argue advances hand in hand with explaining and justifying? Labeling is attaching signs to or associating them with items in the non-linguistic world. It's tempting to think that reliably responding in a distinctive way to some things and not others is a way of classifying them as being of some kind, as having something in common. What more besides dividing things into groups could be required to count as describing them as being of different kinds? The difference between classifying in the sense of labeling and describing emerges when we ask what the things grouped together by their elicitation of a common response are supposed to be described as. If the dog reliably barks at some things and not others, at cats, dogs, and squirrels but not horses, men but not women, motorcycles but not cars, and so on, it's grouping things, sorting them into two classes. But there need be nothing that it's describing them as. When the metal strip in the thermostat expands in some environments and contracts in others, it is not yet describing them as warm or cold. Sellars' idea is that what one is describing something as is a matter of what follows from the classification, what consequences falling in one group or other has. It's insofar as being grouped one way or another can serve as a premise in an inference that the grouping is intelligible as a description and not merely as a label. Reliably differentially elicited responses are intelligible as observation reports, as empirical descriptions, just insofar as they're available to justify further claims. It's essential and not just accidental to descriptive predicates that they can be used to make claims which would be expressed by declarative sentences. And it's essential and not just accidental to those claimings that they can serve as reasons justifying other claims. Sellars sees such modal locutions as tools in the enterprise of, quote, making explicit the rules we've adopted for thought and action. He says, I shall be interpreting our judgments to the effect that A causally necessitates B as the expression of a rule governing our use of the terms A and B. End of the quote from Sellars. The rules those modal expressions formulate are rules of inference. Modal expressions are inference license, or inference tickets in Gilbert Ryle's terminology. These are what Sellars calls material, that is, non-logical inferences. In fact, what these modal locutions make explicit, according to Sellars, are just the implications, situation in a space of which is what distinguishes descriptive concepts from mere labels. He thinks that inferences such as that from Pittsburgh is to the west of New York, so New York is to the east of Pittsburgh, articulate the content of the descriptive concepts west and east. Further, it's the inferential commitments acknowledging such material implicational relations that are appealed to in explanation and justification. Sellars says, quote, to make first-hand use of these modal expressions is to be about the business of explaining a state of affairs or justifying an assertion. End of the quote. That is, what one's doing in using modal expressions, saying all A's are necessarily B's, for instance, is endorsing an inference, from anything's being an A to its being a B. And that's an inference that can be appealed to in justifying one description on the basis of another, or explaining the applicability of one description by the appeal to the applicability of another. The raspberries are red because they're ripe. This is why the expressive resources of description, on the one hand, and justification, on the other hand, advance hand in hand, as Sellars says. This constellation of claims, to which Sellars aspires to entitle himself, articulates what he makes of the tradition of thinking about modality that Kant initiates and Frege develops in an inferentialist key. It's a story that construes at least one kind of modal vocabulary as distinguished by the role it plays in expressing explicitly essential aspects that it makes visible as implicit already in the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. Having a, what Sellars calls, first-hand use in explicating the framework within which vocabulary use can have the significance of describing, a framework we come to see as necessarily a unified package comprising not only description, but justification and explanation, a framework articulated by subjunctively robust inferential relations among descriptive concepts, sets modal vocabulary off from the descriptive vocabulary precisely in virtue of the distinctive expressive role it plays with respect to the use of such descriptive vocabulary. This, then, in outline, is Sellars's modal expressivism. It is, it should be acknowledged, largely programmatic. And turning the program into a full-blooded account of the use of modal vocabulary would require satisfactory responses to a number of challenges. I remarked a minute ago that Sellars' approach focuses on modally qualified conditionals. So, at a minimum, we would need to understand how it might be developed and extended to deal with other uses of modal operators. Another challenge to working out Sellars' version of modal expressivism concerns the extent to which and the sense in which it should be understood as taking the expressive role characteristic of modal vocabulary to be, as he puts it, a metalinguistic one. On the one hand, When Sellars says he wants to understand a paradigmatic kind of modal judgment as, quote, the expression of a rule governing our use of the terms A and B, end of the quote, this sounds straightforwardly metalinguistic in a classic Tarskian sense. On the other hand, it cannot be right to say that modal claims should be understood as covertly made in a meta-language whose mastery requires mastery of terms that refer to terms, here the descriptive terms, in an object language. And that's the classic Tarski-Carnap sense of a meta-language. For someone, perhaps a monolingual German, could claim, believe, or judge that A causally necessitates B without ever having heard of the English expressions that A and B are standing for in the example. And furthermore, the necessity claim, the modal claim, could be true even if there never had been such expressions because there'd never been language users. After all, there still would have been laws of nature even if there'd never been language. So is the view Sellars is after a metalinguistic expressivism or not? In light of the considerations I've just mentioned, Sellars' characteristically nuanced but unhelpful assessment is this, quote, shall we say that modal expressions are metalinguistic? Neither a simple yes nor a simple no will do, end of the quote. He wants to say that while modal statements are not metalinguistic in a narrow sense, there's a wider sense in which they are. Quote, it's sometimes thought that modal statements do not describe states of affairs in the world because they're really metalinguistic. This won't do at all if it's meant that instead of describing states of affairs in the world, they describe linguistic habits. It's more plausible if it's meant that statements involving modal terms have the force of prescriptive statements about the use of certain expressions in the object language. Yet there's more than one way to have the force of a statement, and failure to distinguish between them may snowball into a serious confusion as wider implications are drawn. End of the quote. I think Sellars never actually figures out how to work out the line of thought he suggests here. After the 1959 essay I've been quoting from, he never repudiates the views he sketched in Counterfactual's Dispositions and the Causal Modalities. He seems to continue to endorse them, but he never revisits the topic substantially, never says how he thinks one might go on to fill in the expressivist idea he had gestured at here. Doing that is, in effect, left as an exercise to the reader. Sellars is working with Kant's idea that the expressive role distinctive of a lethic modal vocabulary is to make explicit something that is implicit already in the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. He picks up Frege's hint that what matters is the specifically inferential articulation essential to the conceptual contentfulness of descriptive vocabulary. He develops those thoughts by adding the ideas that the expressive role is in some broad but non-canonical sense metalinguistic, a matter of the role such vocabulary plays in endorsing rules of inference governing descriptive vocabulary. And equally importantly, he focuses our attention on the pragmatic dimension of that expressive role. That is, he counsels us to look at what we're doing when we endorse a modal claim. I want to make a couple of suggestions for how one might move forward with what Sellars made of Kant's thought about how the expressive role characteristic of a lethic modal vocabulary is related to that of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. One lesson I think we can learn from Sellars' difficulties is that the notion of being metalinguistic, or about language, is too crude an expressive tool, too undifferentiated a concept to be helpful in this context. There are, as Sellars intimates, many ways in which the use of one vocabulary can depend on that of another, besides any terms of the one vocabulary referring to those of the others, as in the classical sense of metalinguistic. Putting together Sellars' metalinguistic idea with his pragmatic idea, we could consider the possibility that the place to begin thinking about the expressive role of modal vocabulary is with what, in my Locke lectures between saying and doing, I call a pragmatic metavocabulary. This concept takes its place alongside that of syntactic metavocabulary, which enables one to talk about linguistic expressions themselves, both what Sellars calls sign designs and grammatical categories of them, and alongside a semantic metavocabulary, which enables one to talk about what linguistic expressions refer to or what descriptive concepts let one say, to talk about meaning. A pragmatic metavocabulary enables one to talk about what one is doing in using linguistic expressions, the speech acts one is performing, the pragmatic force one is investing them with or exercising, the commitments one is undertaking by making claims, the norms that govern linguistic performances, and so on. Sellars' model is that modal vocabulary says something that would be said more explicitly in semantic metavocabulary. But by the time his commentary has taken back everything it needs to take back, not much is left of that model. What seems right about the commentary, however, is Sellars' observations about what one is doing in making what he calls first-hand use of modal vocabulary, namely endorsing inferences. Insofar as there is anything to that idea, the more natural strategy would seem to be to take one's model from pragmatic metavocabularies. After all, Sellars ends up saying nothing at all about what one says in making first-hand use of modal vocabulary. He talks about what you do in doing that. Properly understood, then, I think his is not a semantic expressivism about alethic modal vocabulary, but a distinctive kind of pragmatic expressivism about it. As a first try at expressing the thought that would result from transposition of his thought from a semantic into a pragmatic key, we might try this. In making first-hand use of alethic modal vocabulary, one is doing something distinctive that could be specified explicitly in the right kind of pragmatic metavocabulary, namely endorsing a class of inferences. The pragmatic metavocabulary enables one to say what modal vocabulary enables one to do. Such a claim does not in itself involve any commitment concerning the relations between the content of talk about endorsing inferences and talk about necessity and possibility, never mind commitment to their equivalence. My second suggestion for developing Sellars' modal expressivism is that what's special about at least a certain kind of modal vocabulary is that it stands in a special relation to descriptive vocabulary, a relation that invited its characterization as metalinguistic with respect to descriptive vocabulary in the first place. This relation is that anyone who knows how to use ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary like red, square, moving, alive, electron, already knows how to do everything she needs to know how to do to deploy modal vocabulary. In this sense, modal vocabulary makes explicit, in the form of a new kind of claimable content, something that's implicit already in the use of descriptive vocabulary. Not all vocabularies stand in this relation to some other kind of vocabulary. In particular, there's nothing that ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary stands in to this particular expressive relation. We could ask, what aspect of inference is it that modal vocabulary is supposed to express? My third suggestion for developing the Sellars approach to modality is an answer to this question. The key fact to appreciate, I think, is that outside of logic and mathematics, in ordinary language and the special sciences, material non-logical inference is massively non-monotonic. That is, the fact that the inference from P to Q is a materially good one in some situation does not mean that the inference from P and R to Q must also be a good one in the same situation. If I strike this dry, well-made match, it will light, but not if all the oxygen is removed from the room, or a sufficiently strong magnetic field is applied, or if I let loose of the leash, the dog will chase the cat, but not if either one of them is struck by lightning, or a bear suddenly blocks the way, or many other things. This phenomenon is ubiquitous and unavoidable, even in less informal contexts. Differential medical diagnosis, the application of common sense, of common or case law, or philosophical argumentation. One cannot secure material inferences from all possible defeasors by explicitly building their denial into the premises. for the class of possible diffeasors is in general open-ended and not antecedently surveyable or specifiable. Nor can one achieve the same effect wholesale by the use of ceteris paribus clauses, all other things being equal clauses. As I've argued elsewhere, the expressive role of such clauses is explicitly to acknowledge the non-monotonicity, hence the defeasibility of the qualified inference, not magically to remove it. The technical term for a Latin phrase whose application can do that is magic spell. The defeasibility or non-monotonicity of the material inferences essential to the conceptual contentfulness of descriptive vocabulary means that the use of that vocabulary requires not only making a distinction, however fallibly, between those inferences one endorses and those one does not, but also, as part of that capacity, and also fallibly, between the collateral premises or auxiliary hypotheses whose addition one takes it would, and those one takes it would not, infirm the inference, in the sense that the conclusion would no longer follow. That is, in order to use ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, one must associate some range of subjunctive and counterfactual robustness with the material inferences that at least partially articulate the contents of the descriptive concepts. So, for instance, I might endorse the inference that would be made explicit in a conditional by saying, if I release my grip on the book, then it will fall to the floor. But for the attribution of such an inferential commitment to me to be sustainable, I must make some distinction between collateral circumstances that would defeat the inference. A table is moved under it, someone else catches it, it dissolves in a puff of smoke, it's snatched up by a passing hawk, and those that would not infirm it. It's Tuesday, it's a slightly cooler today than it was yesterday, my car is parked slightly farther away. Of course, I might be wrong about whether any of these particular auxiliary hypotheses actually would or would not defeat the inference to the conclusion. But if I make no distinction of this sort at all, I should be convicted of not understanding the concepts like book and falling, that I'm attempting to apply. On this account, subjunctive robustness is the generality or openness that Ryle found in the inferences made explicit by conditionals, and which is made explicit by modal vocabulary, including the subjunctive mood. It involves a kind of quantification over auxiliary hypotheses that would not, according to the modal claim, infirm the inference or the conclusion. The kind of generalization implicit in the use of subjunctive or modal vocabulary is just what's invoked in explanation, which exhibits some conclusion as resulting from an inference that's good as an instance of a kind, or in virtue of a pattern of good inferences. It's because the use of descriptive vocabulary requires commitment to inferences with some range of subjunctive robustness that, as I earlier quoted Sellars as saying, quote, although describing and explaining are distinguishable, they're also in an important sense inseparable. The descriptive and explanatory resources of the language advance hand in hand. The expressive job characteristic of modal vocabulary is to make explicit this implicit dimension of the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. Okay, that's a sketch of a program for extending the Sellars tradition of modal expressivism. It raises a myriad of questions, some of detail and others more substantial. But rather than beginning to fill in that sketch by addressing some of those questions, I want to confront the ideas that motivate it with a different set of intuitions, those that motivate a robust modal realism. So I talked about modal expressivism, now I'm going to talk about modal realism. By modal realism, I mean the conjunction of three claims. One, some modally qualified claims are true. Two, those modally qualified claims that are true state facts. And third, some of those modal facts are objective, in the sense that they're independent of the activities of concept users. Those modal facts would be facts even if there never were or never had been concept users. I think there's strong reasons to endorse all three of these claims. As to the first, that some modal claims are true, physics tells us things such as two bodies acted upon only by gravitational forces necessarily attract one another in direct proportion to the product of their masses and in inverse proportion to the square of the distance between their centers of mass. I take it that that claim, for instance, is true. And even if it's not, I take it that some claims of this form, purporting to state laws of nature, do in fact state laws of nature. Denying that would bring one into direct contradiction with the empirical sciences themselves. Supporting such a position would require a strong argument indeed. For the empirical sciences are in the business of making subjunctive and counterfactual supporting claims. That is, they offer not only descriptions, but modally robust explanations. And indeed, the descriptions they offer are essentially, and not just accidentally, available to figure in explanations of other descriptions, often connected lawfully. The second claim, that those true modal claims state facts, is, I think, true in virtue of the definition of fact. A fact, Frege says, is a thought that is true. He means thought in the sense of something thinkable, not an act of thinking, of course. There can be unthought facts. But on this usage, it's all right to say that facts make thoughts or claims true only in the sense that facts make acts of thinking and claiming true. For the facts just are the true thinkables and claimables. Wittgenstein is appealing to this Fregean way of using the term fact when he says, quote, "When we say and mean that such and such is the case, we and our meaning do not stop anywhere short of the fact, but we mean this is so." On this usage, if there are true modal claims, in the sense of true modal claimables, or modal claimings that are true in that they're claimings of true claimables, then there are modal facts. Modal facts just are facts statable using modal vocabulary, as physical facts are facts statable using physical vocabulary. Nautical facts are facts statable using nautical vocabulary, and so on. The third claim about the objectivity of modal facts is perhaps the most controversial of these three platitudes. But I think the same principle I implicitly invoked in talking about the first claim underwrites the third. Physics tells us that the current laws of nature were already laws of nature before there were human concept users. And although it does not specifically address the issue, physics is clearly committed to the claim that the laws would have been the same even if there had never been concept users. Indeed, many of the laws of nature, including all the Newtonian ones, exhibit a temporal symmetry. They hold indifferently at all times. So they're independent of the advent at some particular time of concept users. And one of the mainstays of physics over the last century, substantially contributing to its distinctive conceptual shape, is the result of the Noether theorem that tells us, entails, that this fundamental temporal symmetry is mathematically equivalent to the physical principle of conservation of energy. Denying the third modal realist claim about the objectivity of modal facts is denying the temporal symmetry of laws of nature. And the theorem tells us that that means denying the conservation of energy. Well, there are reasons from the bleeding edge of physics to worry about the universal truth of the principle of conservation of energy. Those considerations are irrelevant in the current context. They don't have anything to do with the presence or absence of concept users in our world. So I conclude that we cannot deny the third modal realist claim, the objectivity of modal facts, without taking issue with substantial, indeed fundamental empirical issues in physics. And we just ought not to be in that business. There's another line of argument to the conclusion that commitment to modal realism is implicit in commitment to a corresponding realism about claims expressed using ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And it will make clearer the relation between at least one kind of alethic modality and conceptual content. We can begin with a different platitude. There is some way the world objectively is. How it objectively is must be discovered by empirical inquiry, and sets a semantic and epistemic standard for assessments of the correctness of our descriptive claimings as potential expressions of empirical knowledge. The question is how to understand the relation of modal facts, if any, to how the world objectively is as describable, at least sometimes, in non-modal empirical descriptive vocabulary. One might ask a supervenience question here, but the line of thought I'm concerned with goes a different way. It asks what modal commitments are implicit already in the idea of an empirically describable world, and it focuses on the determinateness of the way things objectively are. To talk about how things objectively are as determinate is to invoke a contrast with how they are not. This idea is summed up in the Spinozist and scholastic principle, omnis determinatio est negatio. This thought is incorporated in the 20th century concept of information, due to Claude Shannon, which understands it in terms of the partition each bit establishes between how things are according to the information and how they are not. But there are different ways we might follow out this idea, depending on how we think about the sort of negation involved. What I'll call the Hegelian model of determinateness insists that it must be understood in terms of what he calls exclusive difference and not merely indifferent difference, anschließend rather than gleichgültig difference. The properties square and circular are exclusively different properties, since possession by a plane figure of the one excludes, rules out, or is materially incompatible with possession of the other. Square and green are merely indifferently different, in that although they're distinct properties, possession of the one does not preclude possession of the other. An essential part of the determinate content of a property, what makes it the property it is and not some other one, is the relations of material, non-logical incompatibility it stands in to other determinate properties. For instance, shapes to other shapes and colors to other colors. In fact, in Hegel's view is that determinateness is a matter of standing in relations of material incompatibility, his determinate negation, and material consequence, his mediation, to other determinants. We might think of these as related by the principle that one property, say metallic, is a consequence of another, copper, in case everything incompatible with being metallic, say being a mammal, is incompatible with being copper. A property possession of which rules out possession of no other properties, and has as a consequence possession of no others, is insofar such indeterminate. One reason to endorse this Hegelian conception of determinateness is that it's required to underwrite what might be taken to be an essential aspect of the structural difference between the fundamental ontological categories of object and property. Aristotle had already pointed out a fundamental asymmetry between these categories. It makes sense to think of each property as coming with a converse, an opposite, in the sense of a property that's exhibited by all and only the objects that do not exhibit the index property. Has a mass greater than 5 grams is a property that has a converse in this sense. But it does not make sense to talk about objects as coming with converses or opposites, in the analogous sense of an object that exhibits all and only the properties that are not exhibited by the index object. This is precisely because some of those properties will be incompatible with one another. My left leg has the properties of not being identical to Bach's Second Brandenburg Concerto and of not being identical to Gottlob Frege. Its converse, if it had one, would have to have the properties of being identical to both, but they're not identical to each other. It should be clear that to take the objective world to be determinate in the Hegelian sense, so to consist of objects and their properties, and relations in the Aristotelian sense, and for those properties and relations to exhibit the structure of determinable families of determinants, is to be committed to modal realism. For Hegelian determinateness requires that there be facts about what properties and states of affairs are materially incompatible with what others, and about what material consequential relations they stand in to one another. The determinateness of the fact that this coin is copper consists in part of its being incompatible with the coin being silver, and its having as a consequence that it conducts electricity. That is, with its being necessary that it's not silver, possible that it's green, and necessary that it conducts electricity, all modal properties. Metallurgists discover these modal facts as part of the same kind of empirical inquiry through which they discover that the coin is in fact copper. A world without modal facts would be an indeterminate world, a world without objects in the Aristotelian sense, and without properties in the sense that admits a determinate determinable structure. In laying out Sellars' views, I registered that he thinks of what he calls the causal modalities as characterizing the inferential relations that articulate the contents of empirical descriptive concepts. If we go back to what Hegel made of Kant's views of modality and conceptual content, we find a notion of conceptual content that can help us better understand how this kind of modality can be understood as a conceptual modality. On this conception, to be conceptually contentful just is to stand in modally robust relations of material consequence and incompatibility, Hegel's mediation and determinate negation. This is a resolutely non-psychological sense of conceptual, for it makes no reference to concept use, to the application of concepts by anyone at all. So if there are laws of nature according to which some properties are incompatible with others, that is, cannot be exemplified by the same object at the same time, or that have others as their consequence, so that if one property is exhibited by an object, the other necessarily must be also, then the world as it is objectively, independently of the activity of any knowing and acting subjects, is conceptually articulated. Empirical inquiry is at once the job of determining what judgments are true and what concepts are correct. That is, what really follows from what and what really precludes what. Linguistic terms can express concepts by being used so as to undertake commitments as to what follows from what and what precludes what. But the concepts they express are in no sense products of that concept-applying activity. As we saw, Sellars insists that it's standing in such relations that makes empirical descriptive vocabulary genuinely descriptive, that is, expressive of descriptive concepts, rather than merely functioning as reliably differentially responsively elicited labels. And we've seen that the sort of modal realism I've been sketching has as one of its consequences that empirical descriptive properties and states of affairs stand to one another in relations of material consequence and incompatibility. So Hegel offers us definitions of what it is to be determinate and to be conceptually articulated, according to which the objective world, for the objective world to be determinate, is for it to be modally articulated, that is, to be conceptually articulated. So it commits one both to modal realism and to conceptual realism, the view that the objective world is modally and so conceptually structured, quite apart from its relations to us. That's the objectivity claim. So I've talked about the modal expressivism of my title and the modal realism of my title. The next part says together, and I want to talk about that. The core of the modal realism I've just sketched consists of some claims that express philosophical common sense. There are laws of nature. Events sometimes causally necessitate others. And there is a determinate way the world objectively is, and its being that way rules out, excludes the possibility of its being some other ways. These, I think, are commitments to which any philosopher ought to want to be entitled. They should be contested only under theoretical duress by exceptionally weighty and compelling arguments. But what is the relation between this kind of modal realism and the modal expressivism I talked about in the first part of my talk? There, the expressive role characteristic of modal vocabulary was identified as making explicit the material, inferential, and incompatibility relations, in virtue of which ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary expresses the content that it does. This expressive role was distinguished from that of the ground-level empirical descriptive vocabulary, whose principal job it is to say how things objectively are. There is no further vocabulary to which OED, ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, stands in the same semantically explicative relation as alethic modal vocabulary stands with respect to it. The core of this version of modal expressivism lies precisely in the distinction it insists on between the expressive role distinctive of modal vocabulary and that of vocabulary whose expressive job it is to describe the world, at least in the narrow paradigmatic sense in which OED vocabulary describes the world. Modal realism says that modal vocabulary does describe the world. It does say how things are. So are these two lines of thought just incompatible? Are we obliged to choose between them? I think that the modal expressivism of the first part of my talk and the modal realism of the second part are not only compatible, but that the account of the expressive role distinctive of modal vocabulary is just what's needed to understand the central claims of modal realism. The expressivism complements, rather than conflicting with, the realism about the use of modal concepts. Well, how is such a reconciliation to be understood? The first step is to see that modal expressivism, ME, makes claims about what one is doing in using modal concepts, while modal realism, MR, makes claims about what one is saying by using modal concepts. ME says that what one is doing when one makes a modal claim is endorsing an inference, relating descriptive concepts as subjunctively, including counterfactually, robust, or treating two descriptive concepts as incompatible. MR says that when one does that, one is saying, claiming, that possession or exhibition of one empirical property is a consequence of or is incompatible with possession or exhibition of another. The claim that ME and MR, modal expressivism and modal realism, are compatible is the claim that one can both be doing what ME says one is doing in applying modal vocabulary, and thereby be saying what MR says one is saying by doing that. The claim that these are complementary is the claim that an important way to understand what one's saying by making a modal claim is precisely to think about what one is doing by making such claims. According to this way of understanding the relations between ME and MR, the claims of modal expressivism are made in a pragmatic metavocabulary for modal vocabulary. That is, vocabulary suitable for specifying the practices, abilities, and performances that make up the use of modal vocabulary. And the claims of modal realism are made in a semantic metavocabulary for modal vocabulary. That is, a vocabulary suitable for specifying the meanings or conceptual contents expressed by modal vocabulary. What we have here is an instance of the general question of how to understand the relations between these two complementary aspects of concept application: the use of concepts and their meaning or content, what one's doing in applying them, and what one is saying by applying them. Modal expressivism says that what one's doing in making modal claims is not the same thing as what one is doing in making claims using ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. For in the modal case, but not in the descriptive case, one is, perhaps inter alia, committing oneself to subjunctively robust inferential and incompatibility relations among descriptive concepts that one is not in general thereby applying. Modal realism says that in making modal claims one is saying how things objectively are, describing the objective world. Reconciling the expressivist claim and the realist claim requires specifying a sense of describing or empirical fact stating that's broader than that applicable to the core use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, but still sufficiently akin to it that the broader sense applicable to modal claims and the narrower sense applicable to descriptive claims show up as species of a recognizably descriptive genus. Here's a suggestion: a broader sense of fact stating a description that is not yet so promiscuous as the declarativist candidate that treats all declarative sentences as descriptions, is defined by the dual requirements of semantic government of claimings by facts and of epistemic tracking of facts by claimings. By semantic government, I mean that descriptive claims are subject to a distinctive kind of ought to do. By semantic government, I mean that descriptive claims are subject to a distinctive kind of ought to be, related only in complicated ways to the ought to do's with which Sellars contrasted them. It ought to be the case that the content of a descriptive claiming stands in a special relation, that we might as well call correspondence, to a modal fact, which it accordingly purports to state. And in case there is such a fact, it succeeds in stating. In virtue of that semantic norm, claimings are answerable for their correctness, in accord with that norm, to facts. The underlying thought here is that what one is talking about is what exercises a certain kind of authority over what one says. What one says is responsible to what one is talking about in a way that's characteristic of this relation as semantic. What one is talking about provides a standard for the assessment of the correctness of what one says. What is the nature of the correspondence that the norm enjoins? The contents of possible claimings are articulated by relations of material consequence and incompatibility, related by such relations to the contents of other potential claimings. And those notions are themselves specifiable in deontic normative, pragmatic metavocabularies. Committing or entitling oneself to one claim can commit or entitle one to others and can preclude entitlement to still others. The contents of facts and possible facts are also articulated by relations of material consequence and incompatibility to the contents of other possible facts. In this case, the notions are specifiable in an alethic modal semantic metavocabulary. The obtaining of one fact has the obtaining of others as a necessary, that is, subjunctively, including counterfactually robust, consequence. It makes others possible and rules out still others as not possible. Normative semantic government of claimings by facts says that it ought not to be the case that there's a fact whose content is articulated by objective modal relations of material consequence and incompatibility that line up with the subjective, in the sense of pertaining to knowing and acting discursive subjects, normative relations of material consequence and incompatibility that articulate the content of that claiming. It ought to be the case that there is a corresponding fact. If that norm is not satisfied, the claiming does not live up to the standard provided by the fact it purports to state. Now, where semantic government of claimings by facts is a deontic normative matter, epistemic tracking of facts by claimings is an alethic modal one. It's a matter of the subjunctive and counterfactual robustness of the conceptual content correspondence between facts and claims. The tracking condition holds just insofar as the subjunctive conditional, if the fact were or had been different, the claiming would be or would have been correspondingly different, is true. Insofar as this subjunctive conditional holds, there's a reliable correspondence between the contents of facts and the contents of claimings. That is to say that the inference from a claim about the content of a claiming to the content of the corresponding fact is in general a good one. Now, I think we need both these notions. It's a mistake to try to do all of the work done by the concept of semantic government with that of epistemic tracking, as, for instance, Jerry Fodor and Fred Bretsky do. What goes missing is the fine structure of the crucial interaction between activities on the part of the claiming subject, expressed in deontic normative pragmatic metavocabulary, and how it is with the objects and facts those claims are about, expressed in an alethic modal semantic metavocabulary, and how the two sides stand in normative relations of semantic government and modal relations of epistemic tracking. It's precisely in those intricate relations that the complementary character of modal expressivism and modal realism becomes visible. When the two requirements of semantic government and epistemic tracking are satisfied, it makes good sense to think of the claimings in question as fact-stating and descriptive. They purport to say how things are with what they, in the normative sense of semantic government, are about. The actual applications of the vocabulary in question, no less than their normative status as correct or not, are epistemically responsive to and controlled by the corresponding facts. And this is also evidently true of modal vocabulary, supposing that we grant the dual claims of modal realism and modal expressivism. For modal expressivism tells us that modal vocabulary makes explicit, normatively significant relations of subjunctively robust material consequence and incompatibility among claimable, hence propositional contents, in virtue of which the ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary that's applied in them describes and does not merely label, discriminate, or classify. And modal realism tells us that there are modal facts concerning the subjunctively robust relations of material consequence and incompatibility, in virtue of which ordinary empirical descriptive properties and facts are determinate. Together, these two claims give a definite sense to the possibility of a correspondence of modal claimings with modal facts. If we can then say what it is for a norm of semantic governance to be instituted, and the modal fact of epistemic tracking to be achieved, then the descriptive, the fact-stating character of modal vocabulary, according to modal expressivism and modal realism, will have been made intelligible. It's a consequence of the version of Sellars' modal expressivism that I outlined in the first part of my talk, that instituting normative semantic government of modal claims by modal facts and of achieving modal epistemic tracking of modal facts by modal claims must be an aspect of the process of instituting semantic government of ordinary empirical descriptive claims by the facts they state, and of achieving epistemic tracking of those facts by ordinary empirical descriptive claims. For the essence of that view is that what's expressed explicitly, that is put in claimable propositional form, by the use of modal vocabulary, is already implicit in the norms governing the use of OED vocabulary. Determining and applying descriptive concepts inevitably involves commitment. It involves committing oneself as to the subjunctively robust inferential and incompatibility relations that they stand into one another. Rectifying concepts, determining facts, and establishing laws are all projects that must be pursued together. Empirical evidence bears on all of the semantic, epistemic, and explanatory tasks at once, or it bears on none of them. And if that's right, then modal claims, and the concepts that articulate them, exhibit semantic government by an epistemic tracking of facts no less than ordinary empirical descriptive ones do. Far from being incompatible with this fundamental, modally realistic claim, modal expressivism is just what's needed to make it intelligible. By showing how the use of modal concepts and the use of ordinary empirical descriptive concepts are inextricably bound up with one another, modal expressivism shows itself and modal realism to be two sides of one coin. Okay, that's what I meant by saying they were together. I've argued that modal realism and the right kind of modal expressivism belong together. The tendency to understand views of this kind as incompatible alternatives, to take the sense in which modal vocabulary plays, as Sellars put it, a metalinguistic expressive role relative to ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, taking those views to rule out the possibility of its being also fact-stating and descriptive of something other than language use, is the result of failing to attend to the distinction between pragmatic and semantic metavocabularies. Well, I've finished my argument, but I want to close with the lagnape, indicated in the final word of my title. Why claim, as the title does, that the result of the story is to put modal expressivism and modal realism together again? why should the story be thought of as recounting a reunion? The answer I want to leave you with is this. It's because we've seen something very like this constellation of metaconceptual commitments before. I started my story with Kant, and that's where I want to end it. Claiming that one should be a pragmatic modal expressivist, that is, an expressivist about what one is doing in applying modal vocabulary, but a semantic modal realist, that is, a realist about what one is saying in applying modal vocabulary, is, I think, recognizably a development of and a descendant, for this special but central case, of Kant's claim that one should be a transcendental idealist but an empirical realist. That's what I mean by saying that the view I've been presenting puts modal expressivism and modal realism together again. Thank you for your attention.